Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Help yourself to lunch if you haven't already. My name's Carl Pearson. I'm the Associate Director in the Center for the Study of the Middle East, or as we call it, SESAME, trying to force an acronym. I'd like to apologize on behalf of our director who's unable to attend today. He was very much looking forward to being here, but cannot be. Center for the Study of the Middle East is a U.S. Department of Education funded national resource center, and we appreciate the U.S. government's largesse in helping us to do this event as well as our other events. One of the things they ask of us is to collect information from our guests, so you'll find a QR code scattered about the room. If you are willing to complete a survey, we will appreciate your input. I'm happy to introduce our guest today, Dr. Marsin Alshamary. She is an assistant professor of political science at Boston College. Her research examines the intersection of religion and politics in the Middle East, looking particularly at how the Shia religious establishment in Iraq has intervened in formal politics, in protest, and in peace building. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and a faculty affiliate at the Middle East Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School. The title of her talk today is The Dilemma of Religious Leadership, Authority, Succession, and Protest in Iraq. And on behalf of Center for the Study of the Middle East and Indiana University, welcome. We're looking forward to hearing your
Thank you so
views.
much. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for attending. And thank you, Carl, for setting everything up so seamlessly. I'm sad Ambassador Strabadi can't be here, but I've talked enough with him that I'm sure he'll probably be bored of my talk if he had to be here in person. I wanted to start by saying I'm very much in the weeds of this topic. So if at any point I'm losing you and you just have a clarifying question, please don't feel shy about asking it. We're a small enough group that should happen quite easily. So please stop me at any point you feel like there's something critical that I'm missing here. I've presented variations of this research to different audiences, and I always try to calibrate it to someone who is a little bit familiar with the Middle East. But like I said, please don't hesitate at all. I wanted to start the talk today by bringing it to something that is relevant to the news and to what we see in the world today, which is on October 8th of this year, a right-wing Israeli channel 14, I believe, posted photos of several individuals with the crosshairs on their faces that you can see, and indicated that they were potential targets of assassination by Israel. The list included some very obvious figures: the acting Secretary General of Hezbollah, Yahya Sinwar of Hamas, who has now been assassinated, the Houthi leaders movement leader Abdel Malik al-Houthi, and others that aren't really surprising. However, the image on the far right over here, or far left, well, for you it's the far right, is Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who is really a surprising figure to include here. So his inclusion invited a lot of uproar in Iraq and across the Middle East, and everyone was quite surprised that he would even be put on this list, because he is one of the highest authorities, one of the highest religious figures in Shia Islam, and really quite a respected figure. And so Shia Muslims constitute about 15 to 20% of the global Muslim community, and a lot of them live in Iraq, Iran, Bahrain, and presumably we have a majority in Lebanon, but we haven't had a census in a while, so we're not quite sure. But he happens to be the spiritual leader for a lot of these Shia Muslims, particularly the ones in Iraq, but also extending outside of it. The Iraqi government immediately condemned including him in this list. They criticized it as, quote, part of Israeli media's actions as part of a broader effort to discredit religious leaders, especially in the context of the ongoing violence in Gaza and in Lebanon. Interestingly, the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Alina Romanowski, actually very quickly issued a statement on formerly Twitter, now X, saying, Grand Ayatollah Sistani is a renowned and respected religious leader in the international community. He is a critical and influential voice in promoting a more peaceful region. We reject any suggestion of targeting Grand Ayatollah Sistani. The US continues to support efforts to promote peace in the region. By many, Sistani is considered to be a man of peace. In March 2021, he met with Pope Francis, who later commended him for his, quote, commitment to those who suffered persecution, persevering the sacredness of life and the importance of unity of the Iraqi people, end quote. So within Iraq and outside of it, Grand Ayatollah Sistani is considered to be a proponent of peace, of coexistence between different faiths. So why did his photo end up on this list? Now, there's obvious answers and ones that we have to dig into a little bit more. So the obvious answer might be something like the Iraqi government's explanation, which was it was an attempt to discredit a religious figure in an ongoing war that some people are trying to frame as a religious war. But in my view, this doesn't go far enough. I think that a large reason of why religious figures are included in photos like this, but in other attempts at discrediting them, is that in particular, Shia religious leaders have a lot of latent power to mobilize and to demobilize people. And that power is very incomprehensible to state actors and also to just international powers that operate in the region. And so to make this argument that their power is so incomprehensible and therefore threatening, I'm going to start by just giving you a basic background of what he even stands for, what a Grand Ayatollah is, what is the religious institution that he's a part of. But then I'm also going to tie this to how it can become a source of stress or confusion or uncertainty for political actors. And this is moving way beyond Israel. This is talking about Iraqi political actors, Americans, British, anyone else just observing the sphere. Before I delve into all of this, I did want to say, I wanted to present a little bit of why you should believe me or trust me when I say this. This isn't just my random thoughts that I think about every now and then, but I just completed a book manuscript on the Shia religious establishment in Iraq, and this draws a lot from my book. And the research of the book involved years of fieldwork in Iraq, where I interviewed over 200 clerics and people close to them, policymakers, historians who work in the shrine cities in Iraq and who focus on this. I've also done a lot of archival work in different archives, including the ones in Iraq that house the documents of the seminaries, as well as in the US. I've done a lot of research in the archives of the Ba'ath Party that had ruled Iraq from 1968 to 2003. And the archives were taken out of the country and are now the Hoover Institute at Stanford. So I've looked over a lot of documents, I've interviewed a lot of people, and I've spent a lot of time, just as they say, soaking and poking around the actual spaces in the seminary. I'm happy to talk more about the research process if any are graduate students and want to discuss this a bit more in the Q&A. So I wanted to first very quickly introduce a few somewhat confusing terms, but to really establish the baseline of the presentation. So the Shia religious establishment of Iraq is a term that I use to connote really two different institutions. One is a set of seminaries, and then the other one is a religious leadership. So this entire institution is a set of seminaries, of clerical offices, of libraries, of like dormitories housing students even, that's centered around the shrines, various holy shrines in southern and south central Iraq. So the one that's in red is really the most prominent. It's the shrine of Imam Ali. You can see glimpses of it in this photo. And this is the most important seminary for Shia in Iraq, but it's also the city that houses the religious leadership as well. And these two institutions, the leadership and the seminary, are interlinked because the Shia leadership for the entire community also happens to be like the head of the seminary, so the highest ranking teachers in it. To give you an idea of, what these spaces of learning look like, the seminaries, I have some photos of what I think is actually a quite nice seminary over here. You can see the books are beautifully organized. And then you can see a little space of learning here with actually some younger kids and a man wearing a turban that's teaching. So this is what they call the Hausa, which just means a space, and it means the space of learning specifically. And it's about 1,000-year-old seminary in a very classic Islamic sense. So this is what Al-Azhar in Egypt would have looked like back in the day. It's what Zaytuna would have looked like back in the day in Tunisia. The most basic idea of a madrasa in the traditional sense, the only thing that's non-traditional about it is that it operates pretty much the same way even to this day. And that means it doesn't have standardized exams like we would have in the US. So no GREs, no SATs, nothing like that. There is a idea of a curriculum, but it's not a very rigid one. There's no clear process of how people move from position to position within it. And it really relies on students being very much motivated to pursue this. The entire period of learning that takes place as a student, between the lowest ranking student to what they call the Kharij student or the advanced student, can take up to 20 years. And at the end of it, you don't get a certificate or a degree that you can take to the government and ask them for a job. So you really have to be in this for specific reasons, right? You're either very devoted to religious studies and you see yourself having a career as a cleric, which is entirely separate from how the state employs clerics, like completely independently. Or more often you're someone from a clerical family, and this is just what everyone in your family has done. So in order to really sustain itself, this institution started developing mechanisms that made it independent of the state for several years. So one of these mechanisms is that it developed the concept of something called taqlid, or emulation. And it basically said that when you reach a level where you're such a advanced student that you are qualified to infer Islamic rulings, you can then propose to be a guide for people in the community, so for adherents. And you can basically guide people in their personal practice and their social life. You can basically issue Islamic jurisprudence in that way. And that person is called a mujtahid. And as they advance and have more and more followers, they rise in the hierarchy. You must have heard terms ayatollah and grand ayatollah, just connoting how advanced someone is in the seminary, but also how many people follow them and think of them as their religious guide, someone who can tell them to do something or not to do it. The most followed cleric is the one at the very tip of this pyramid. This pyramid exists in different cities and different countries, but in Iraq today, it is really monopolized by the city of Najaf, whose authority extends even transnationally because it's that important of a seminary. And at the very top of it today, we have several figures, but Grand Ayatollah Sistani is a chief among them. And a key question is what happens when he passes away. He's 94 as of August, and people are, concerned about the process of succession, which I'm also happy to get into. The other key issue with emulation is that people are also expected to pay a religious tax to their religious leader, and that kind of keeps the seminary going. It allows these clerics to pay stipends to their students and to really just keep them not needing any support from anyone else. But it also is what gives the institution what they call, if you speak to clerics, they'll say it's quasi-democratic because a follower can select a cleric and that cleric rises and becomes famous and popular because more and more people follow them. So you can see why they would describe it somewhat as that. So, this very quick description of this institution with these just keywords I wanted to highlight. Why is it so threatening or alarming to political authorities and to just government figures throughout the Middle East and particularly within Iraq? So the argument I make is that first, its financial independence tends to alarm state authorities because it means it doesn't need them. I also argue that there's a lot of ambiguity about its authority and how close it is to the political realm. Does it stop at the personal? Do they just tell people how to pray? Or do they tell them to go out and protest, for example? And finally, and this is more of a recent development, its perceived closeness to Iran has a particular impact in when it comes to foreign relations and international affairs. So going to the first issue of financial independence, what's distinguished this institution from its Sunni counterparts, both within Iraq and throughout the Middle East, for years, including under the Ottoman Empire, is that the Shia clerics in Iraq were never employees of the states. They were never salaried civil servants in the way that you saw in the Ottoman Empire, in Egypt and Turkey. And then going forward in Iraqi history, they never became employed by the state in the era of pan-Arabism. So while people like Jamal Abdel Nasser had worked very hard to ensure that Al-Azhar University becomes somewhat secular and that he could appoint the head of the institution and that he made it into a very modern university and kind of took away its traditional aspects, that process never unfolded in Iraq. And the reason this was made possible was because of these mechanisms they created for emulating and for providing resources and money to clerics that really made them not reliant on the state. Interestingly, though, keep in mind that Shia clerics in Iran had a completely different relationship with the Safavid state and with the Qajar state, which it had a closer relationship to over the years. So in this case, the Shia clerics operating in Iraq have been unique in their ability to have independence. So one thing you should know about the clerics is that they're extremely proud of this historic independence and really want to preserve it. So I have a very long quote that I will read to you from a cleric I spoke with when I asked about the possibility of modernizing the institution. He says, when I want to compare the school of Najaf, meaning the seminary, to the rest of the world, the school of Najaf is incomparable. When you say Al-Azhar, yes, Al-Azhar has a leadership, but the government has a role. The opinion of the Azhar and the strength of the Azhar is derived from their government. However, my strength, or Sayyid Hakim, Sistani, or Fayyad, here he's talking about the Grand Ayatollahs in Najaf, is that their decision is autonomous. We, the Hawza, the seminary, have exclusivity or uniqueness. Its leadership comes from within it. Its academic standards are self-monitored, not from the outside. There is no external monitor. The real monitor is my teacher. After my teacher, this Hawza street, so that when I say I am one of the students of Najaf, the other students of Najaf immediately start questioning, who's your teacher? Who are your students? What class do you teach? What is your scholarly level? This framework gives each student in Najaf the right to object to me when I speak. You have no right to speak. This is not your level. Is that clear? There is no state that is in control. There is no sultan except knowledge and the people of knowledge only. For that reason, Najaf as a Hawza, as a seminary, cannot be compared to another. And if you continue this conversation with this cleric or with other clerics that I spoke with, they'll make it very clear that they know this independence rests on the concept of emulation, the fact that people decide to follow them and give them a good chunk of their disposable income. However, usually working alongside the issue of financial independence, that the state can't suddenly stop salaries and control how the clerics behave, is the issue of uncertainty about how far religious authority extends into the political realm. So we understand that clerics can guide their adherents to, break your fast at this time or start, observing Ramadan at this day or that day, right? These things seem innocuous. They're just how you practice as a Muslim. However, it starts to also slowly get into things that we traditionally think of as state authority in the present case. So that's issues like custody and marriage and divorce and inheritance. Clerics consider this to be within their purview, within what is social authority for them. But this is also sometimes within the state's purview as well. And we have this big debate ongoing in Iraq right now about the personal status law or the family law, and how much it should be controlled by clerics versus by just lay individuals. Even more alarmingly from the state's perspectives, clerics can conceivably tell people to go and protest or to vote or not vote or to even pick up arms and fight if they so choose, because it's not clear how far they perceive their authority extends. And that's largely because there's theological differences that I won't get into as a political scientist about how clerics view their role in society. And of course, this is perpetuated by the legacy of Khomeini in Iran, who decided that, clerics are the rightful leaders of a country. You know, he developed the concept of the rule of the jurist, which means the rule of the most highly ranked cleric. But even in Iraq, which is traditionally described as being as having less politically active clerics than Iran, Iraq has a strong history of political activism by clerics. In 1918, the British were trying to have a plebiscite for deciding a ruler to lead Iraq. And of course, they had their favorites, right, on there, trying to manipulate the population into picking one. At the time, Grand Ayatollah Shirazi, who was the highest ranked cleric in Iraq, issued a religious edict saying that no Muslim may choose to elect any other than a Muslim to an emirate or a sultanate over Muslims, clearly saying there can't be a non-Muslim leading Muslims, therefore you can't really vote in this plebiscite in this particular way. So it's clearly a religious opinion in the political realm. Nearly a century later, we have Grand Ayatollah Sistani issuing a fatwa, a religious edict, urging Iraqis to vote in the first election after 2003, making it almost an obligation for them to go out and vote. Back to 1920, Shirazi himself played a major role in getting Iraqis to mobilize to fight the British. And then going forward to 2014, Sistani mobilized Iraqis to fight ISIS. So that's a clear political intervention for a body of clerics that people tend to dismiss as being apolitical or quietist. So in this sense, you can understand why a state would be wary of where their authority extends to when it's not delineated clearly. But the final problem from the state's perspective here is that the religious establishment in Iraq is often perceived as being too closely tied to Iran. Now, this is complicated and not entirely true, but the first reason that they think this is the case is because many clerics in Iraq are of Iranian origins. So what I have up here is as far as I can measure, the ethnic or national identity of different clerics from 1910 to the present. But it's only now become quite dominated by Iraqis. If I had showed you the breakdown, which I wish I had, of like the early 20th century, it would have been predominantly Persian clerics. And there's nothing wrong with that. The city was a transnational cosmopolitan city in which a lot of clerics were practicing. And in addition to that, there was no reason to claim that Iraqis only had to be Arab. There were plenty of Iraqis of Persian origins who have lived in Iraq for centuries. But there was this narrow-minded concept of Iraqi identity being tied to Arab identity that started to rise during the era of Pan-Arabism and really was blown out of proportion by the Ba'athist rule in 1968 to 2003, so that there became a conflation between national loyalty to Iran and just simply being of Persian origin. So this is really the primary reason this idea exists, is because a lot of clerics are of Iranian origin, including Sistani himself, who was born in Iran. And this is very easy to see when you look at the documents of the Ba'ath Party. So between 1968 and 2003, they ruled Iraq with an iron fist, but particularly after 1979, they became very wary of clerical authority. And they also had this pattern of deporting Iraqis of Iranian origin or Persian origins, including ones that were not even in the seminary or related to any clerics. But they had different tools for which they tried to control the religious establishment, and that included denying visas to foreign students, included arrests of clerics, exile of them, and included clamping down on religious pilgrimages in order to try to contain their popularity, but also try to contain their money-making ability through the lectures they provide in pilgrimages. Anyway, their entire attempt resulted in decreasing the number of students from about 7,000 in 1970 to about 500 by the 1990s. So they were quite successful at clamping down on this institution. Keep in mind, despite having the ability to impact it financially. But they didn't really want to destroy it entirely. They wanted to control it. They wanted to co-opt it. And their vision was to have a Grand Ayatollah who was not only an Arab, but an Arab that was loyal to them. And if you read their internal documents, they're very much interested in creating this Arab Grand Ayatollah that they could control. And you can see in this up here that there's a directive from the elites of the Ba'ath Party telling their lower ranking I suppose you can call them minions at the local level, to not antagonize the sons of Hui, who is the leader of the seminary and who is of Iranian origin, which they actually write that in the document about him, or the religious Hausa in the present time, because alienating them means that the movement of the Hausa from Iraq to Iran, and this is what the spiteful Persian enemy is striving for. And as soon as we can prepare an alternative marja or Grand Ayatollah from Arab roots, then he will take the Hausa and he will have his followers and supporters. So this was ideally what they wanted. And it was all premised around this figure of Iran that they wanted to avoid. What's interesting, though, is that they weren't the first or the last government entity to want to co-opt or control this institution. After 2003, Iran's government tried very hard to groom a successor to Sistani, someone named Mahmoud Shahrudi. And, they sent him to Najaf. They tried to get him a following so they could, place him as a successor and then be able to have this influence. But they also failed because he just was not welcomed by the social infrastructure that is set around this seminary, which has historically been very self-preservationist, so that everyone inside it really knows everyone else. And if you don't behave in this specific way, then you will likely not be welcome and not be able to rise within this institution. And years before him, in 1968, Khomeini wasn't able to really be part of this seminary. Despite him spending 13 years in Iraq, he consistently felt like an outsider in the seminary. So, as you can see, there's a variety of factors really that have influenced the opinions and the behaviors of Iraqi and foreign governments towards the religious establishment in Iraq. And this goes, very far back. For example, under British colonialism, you have Gertrude Bell, who was the informal advisor to the High Commissioner for Mesopotamia, Percy Cox. And she has some very famous quotes about Shia clerics that you can find online if you read her letters to her father. So in one of them, she is visiting the holy city of Najaf, where the seminary is, and she writes, "It's a problem here how to get in touch with the Shia, not the tribal people in the country. We're on intimate terms with all of them, but the grimly devout citizens of the holy towns, and more especially the leaders of religious opinion, the mujtahids, the clerics, who can loose and bind with a word by authority which rests on an intimate acquaintance with accumulated knowledge entirely irrelevant to human affairs and worthless in any branch of human activity." So she disparages their learning of this 1,000-year-old seminary. And then later, she also very famously writes to her father that she doesn't doubt for a moment that the final authority must be in the hands of the Sunnis, in spite of their numerical inferiority. Otherwise, you will have a mujtahid-run theocratic state, which is the very devil. So very clear views towards a religious establishment. And of course, keep in mind, this was all written within the context of a revolution that was organized against the British, partially by these very same clerics. At another point, she says that she regrets not letting a cleric teeter into his grave because he then helped launch a revolution against the British. And interestingly, she also at one point compares them to the Pope, to the Vatican, to the Catholic hierarchical institution, which she's not the only one who does that. In 2003, when the US invades Iraq, they make a similar comparison between the Catholic Church, the Pope, and the Grand Ayatollah. So there's this book that you can read if you're interested. It's Paul Bremer, who was the leader of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, and he wrote a book called My Year in Iraq. And he talks about various ways in which Grand Ayatollah Sistani was a thorn in his side and didn't let the procedures that they had wanted to unravel smoothly. So at one point he writes, Ayatollah Ali Hosseini Sistani was the most senior leader of the Najaf Marja'iyya, the religious leadership, and the spiritual head of the Hausa, the seminary, the revered center of Shia learning for centuries until the mullahs took over Iran in 1979. Like the Pope, Sistani did not directly operate on the daily hurly-burly of politics, but exerted his influence through private discussions with devout followers and the occasional public statement or decree. So throughout his book, Bremer talks about how there are individuals who are closely tied to Sistani who intervene in politics. And some of Sistani's biggest interventions in Iraq post 2003 is that he insisted that the Iraqi constitution be written by an elected body of Iraqis rather than by an appointed body. And he pushed for faster elections for this constitution writing committee than what the American powers were hoping for. That being said, in retrospect, some Iraqis had wished we had more time to write the constitution, but that's a discussion for another time. He also had his representatives present in the internal discussions of the Constitution. So one of the Constitution writers was actually his representative, like an actual cleric who was there, who still represents him to this day. He later made voting a religious obligation for his followers in the first election. He approved the Constitution and basically guided people to vote yes on the referendum. And as I previously mentioned, in 2014, he mobilized Iraqis to fight against ISIS. This had a lot of repercussions for the security establishment in Iraq, which we can also talk about. It's just some people said that he inadvertently enabled and empowered non-state paramilitary groups to control the country. We don't know if that was his intention, but the point is that he did intervene strongly in politics. And then in 2019, he encouraged the prime minister of Iraq to step down in the face of mass anti-government protests. So this is his intervention in a brief period, about a 20-year period after 2003. And then there's more minute details about how this all unfolded. Sometimes he'd intervene through a direct statement. Sometimes it was someone who represents him who kind of signaled or hinted, particularly when it comes to forcing down a prime minister. That always happened behind the scenes. So after 2003, Iraqi politicians, unsurprisingly, didn't want to destroy the Hawza or the Shia religious establishment, but they very much wanted its authority and to co-opt it. And specifically, we're talking about the Shia Islamists who came to dominate Iraqi political scene after 2003. So they very eagerly claimed to be his chosen party. They, eagerly flocked to Najaf to take photos with him or to be seen with him as a way to get people to vote for them and to kind of steal some of that legitimacy. But this actually came at a huge price for the religious establishment because the Shia Islamists that they had implicitly endorsed and legitimized ended up performing terribly when they went into power. They were corrupt, they were unable to provide services, they were unable to provide jobs, and their favorability went down tremendously. However, the issue is that the clerical establishment really suffered too because of this association. And we can also talk about how strong this actual association was. So one of the clerics I interviewed said to me, when some religious organizations entered political activity, and here he really means like the Islamist parties who had been underground prior to 2003 and came to rule Iraq after, this reflected badly on religion, and the street started to reject the turban, meaning clerics. They started to dislike the religious establishment. Why? Because they saw it as an authority that was responsible for 15 years of destruction and devastation that had befallen the country. This is how the street perceives the situation. Keep in mind, between 2005 and 2008, Iraq was in the middle of a sectarian civil war. From 2014 to 2017, Iraq was in the middle of an ISIS war. There really wasn't a moment of peace for the country at the same time that it was being led by a consociational state in which Shia Islamist parties tended to be the prime ministerial candidates here. So we have some data on this. This shows over here that between 2013 and 2018, more and more Iraqis started to prefer a non-religious party. And if you talk to Iraqis today, most of them would say that they prefer a non-religious party. And I'm happy to talk about the development of new political parties in Iraq if you're interested in that. More directly relevant to our discussion is the favorability of clerics going down severely in Iraq over the years. So I'm showing you here some Arab barometer polling from Basra in southern Iraq, Babylon, Baghdad, and Qadisiyah. Basra and Baghdad have more of a mixed population. Basra, there's all predominantly Shia, but obviously Baghdad has a much larger Sunni and Christian community, as does Basra. Babylon and Qadisiyah are predominantly Shia communities. And you can see that across the years from 2013 to 2018, across these Shia-dominant governorates, the trust in religious leaders has slid down in every single one. And, if you ask people who they mean by religious leaders, this means both the religious establishment, but you could also have some pollution in the polling because people might also perceive it to be like Islamist leaders. But I can also talk about more public opinion polling on this and where we are today, and just pull up on some interviews of people with about religious authority in Iraq and its perception. Interestingly, this authority of religious leaders has gone down throughout the country, actually. So if you did polling for northern Iraq and western Iraq, you would get the same, but that's impacted by the ISIS war, in which people started to believe that religious leaders in those areas had something to do with ISIS ideology, which is a very simplistic view of it, but it did impact the favorability of religious leaders there. So this became even more pronounced when a large-scale protest movement broke out in 2019, starting in October, and really only ending when COVID broke out in February 2020. Largest protest movement in post-2003 history, thousands of people, and predominantly in the Shia areas of Iraq. So the areas that that are supposedly represented by the Islamist parties, and the traditional places where clerics get their legitimacy from, because that's their followers, the people who pay religious taxes, or at least follow the religious directives. And these protests had a very Shia identity too. There's several articles written about how even like the processes of the protest replicated the Shia pilgrimages and Shia cultural displays. But what we see here is this interesting, not quite alliance, but parallel behavior almost of protesters and clerics. At this point, the religious establishment had distanced itself from politicians because they were not doing well in the world of public opinion, but also, really casting a bad image of religion in general. So they had kept their distance. Grand Ayatollah Sistani stopped meeting with politicians. It would only meet with people who were symbolic figures. And at the same time, they really wanted to look like they were in support of the Iraqi people in general. So they towed a very fine line in these protest movements. And what's interesting is that the everyday protesters that you spoke with were a mix of religious and non-religious, but the protest leaders were all very secular. They described themselves as civic, the Arabic word being madani, which is this specifically Middle Eastern concept of secular, but without the connotations of secularism that atheism tends to produce in the Middle East. So they all described themselves as such, but at the same time, they all said that they were following very closely the Friday sermons of Grand Ayatollah Sistani's representatives because they wanted to see if he would support them. And they actually very much wanted his support and legitimation. So it wasn't just the politicians who wanted it. It was also the civil society leaders. And you can see one of the quotes up here from someone saying, I'm secular and liberal, but I still believe there's common ground between me and the religious establishment. It was very much a practical thing as well. So the religious establishment calibrated its response to the protest movement very carefully. They didn't want to lose any more public goodwill, so they continuously demanded that there be no violence against protesters. They disparaged the corruption of the state. They also cautioned against the disruption of daily life, particularly attacking public property, which is something that they always do consistently throughout Iraqi history. But they also pushed for the prime minister to step down to kind of carve a path forward for the Iraqi protesters to get early elections. Because if you talk to them, their worst nightmare is revolution, because that breeds political instability and just unrest. For a lot of these clerics, they don't take violence or war lightly. They also don't take revolution or instability lightly. So every time they see anything disruptive, including protests, they act in a way that maximizes the existence and the continued peaceful existence of their seminary and their followers. So it was a very carefully calibrated response. And to this day, they continue distancing themselves from political leaders, with the exception of meeting with some UN and other representatives concerning the crisis in the Middle East right now. So it's not surprising that the Shia religious establishment in Iraq attracts a lot of attention. I gave you a very brief overview of the history, but I've shown you how it's been able to accomplish a lot of, incredible things in its history. Things like shepherding Iraq towards elections at a moment in which it could have mobilized them against an American occupation. But at the same time, a very careful analysis of their behavior, which I couldn't do in this presentation, but which I do in the book, is that their primary motivation is really the protection of this 1,000-year-old institution that they belong to. And they really view themselves as academics more than they view themselves as politicians. In fact, they would be offended if you told them that they were behaving like politicians. They really want to protect their adherents from instability and chaos. And sometimes that makes them potentially too status quo oriented. But they're also, despite this, remarkably resilient to outside intruders. This doesn't mean just the Iraqi government's attempts to co-opt, but it also means the attempts by various foreign governments, including the Americans and the British before them. But critically in this moment, it also means the Iranian government as well, which I think gets a lot less attention. Anyway, with that, I will open it up for questions on anything that might have struck your interest in this presentation. Thank you.
Late 90s, talking to the younger Shiite activists in the U.S. Muslim Student Association people. They were arguing for making Marja'iyya more like the papacy, clear lines of authority, less of the disagreement among the ulama. My wife and I thought that was a terrible idea. Is this an idea that's, and obviously it's misunderstood by the various imperial powers, for whom the Shiite ulama were pretty much a closed book. But is this idea still floating around?
So if it does float around, it's by people who can't really enforce it, right? It's by lay activists or Shia who are interested in being part of this conversation, but they're not the insiders. Within the Hausa, so to give you an example, I had gone around and asked them if they were interested in institutionalizing the seminary more, because I heard a lot of complaints from their lower ranking students that once they finished, they couldn't really go get a job because they didn't have a certificate. So I went and asked, do you want to see it more institutionalized? And they would say, are you asking us if we want to kill our own institution? To them, making it any more legible means they're more susceptible to the state. And I think what's so funny is that people think because the state post-2003 is dominated by Shia politicians, that means that they feel comfortable, but they still don't feel comfortable with the state. I think it'll take some generational turnover for a new generation of clerics to rise that doesn't have such an antagonistic history with the state, for them to feel more comfortable about really making it more of an institutionalized structure, having it be more legible. But in terms of having like one religious leader for the entirety of the Shia community, I think just that's impossible to do because the system is built on competition and the competition of various seminaries. So the only way that would happen is if Iran monopolized everything. But I truly don't see that coming.
I remember time when scholarship says there's a period when there's one grand ayatollah that everybody follows, and then immediately you find people who are following other ayatollahs at the same time.
Exactly, yeah.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderful lecture. I remember going to the Google archives, seen a lot of correspondence between Maktab al-Rias, the presidential office, and other branches of the government. And some of them were related to the relationship between the religious establishment. And it's obviously a fascinating chapter in the history of Iran. But now that I'm thinking about the role of Iran in this same establishment, do you think we might find in the future the same kind of archives to document the relationship between the Shia religious establishment in Iraq and the regime in Iran?
Oh, I mean, that would be such an interesting set of documents, right? So the relationship the strong relationship is between the clerics, right? So the clerics in Iraq and the clerics in Iran. That doesn't always mean the Iranian state. So I think what you would uncover is strong ties, and I don't think anyone's trying to hide them between the seminary in Iran and the seminary in Iraq. But the seminary in Iran itself has a very complicated relationship with the Iranian state. I mean, I think we would probably find evidence of the Iranian state attempting to send more clerics to Najaf to try to get some kind of figure established there, similarly to what they had done with Shahrudi, to what the Ba'athis had tried to do with their so-called Arab successor. So I think the prospect of attempted infiltration is one we would find evidence of anywhere.
So the word that you didn't spend much time on is succession.
Mhm.
You mentioned it once in context of Iran's role. So succession.
Oh, so succession is the $1 million question, right? In this, because people tend to think, is it going to be a period of instability? What happens when Iraq doesn't have someone like Sistani? So my personal reading of it is that these fears are largely overblown, that succession has been taking place in this institution for centuries. And what usually happens is that there is a successor from the pool of people who are almost at the same level, but they also tend to be almost the same age, right? So they also will probably, you're basically looking to two periods of succession. One was someone closer to Sistani in age, and then someone from the next generation. But there's already people in the seminary that have been named as potential successors. So the process should not be any different just because it's the post-2003 state. I also don't think it will create political instability in Iraq, given that the religious establishment had stepped away. In fact, I think it would be good for the religious establishment to have a period of a bit of hands-off from politics while they calibrate their succession. So I think it won't be anything dramatic. Sometimes people fear that someone unsuitable would rise. So the name of, and to me this is laughable, by the way, the name of Muqtada Sadr, who's a very populist cleric. Some people ask me, oh, will he succeed Sistani? I would bet my everything I own that he would not, because he's just not qualified to, and he's not even part of the institution. Sorry? Yeah, see, we're so comfortable with this, right? Not going to happen. When I say it's a self-preservationist system, I mean that you really have to become socially conformed into what they want you to be. You will basically get another Sistani. The only thing that's been exceptional about him is that he lived through exceptional times, not that he himself was an outlier.
I want to comment on one thing. You mentioned that there is a big difference between a Shi'i establishment at the beginning of the 20th century and one. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British, as you mentioned, 1918, 1916, 17, they tried to bribe Ayatollah Saddam Hussein and to bribe him so that he will not support the reaction against the British. And they totally refused. And the British paid highly in their attack of southern Iraq.
Yeah.
But the US learned the lesson and it spent $55 million bribing the clerics not to have an edict against the American invasion of Iraq. And that's also a tradition of these. And that's what many Iraqis are now, anti-religious establishment, part of it. So now my question, how much the religious establishment has influence on civil laws presently?
That's an excellent question. Right now, the big discussion in Iraq is that Iraq has had a personal status law from the time of Abdul Karim Qasim, so for decades now. That's actually considered to be one of the best personal status laws in the region. People forget that it is actually inspired by Islamic law to an extent, so it's not completely secular, but it's considered one that's, quite progressive compared to other countries in the region. And it's been in place for decades and has come under attack a few times after 2003 by Islamist parties. And we've reached a point now where it's under attack so much that we think we might lose it. And what's happening is that the Shia Islamist parties are trying to pass a law that says that Iraq will have basically 3 different personal status laws. One that's defined by the Shia clerics, one that's defined by the Sunni clerics, and then the third one is the one that we already have right now. And a family can choose, 1, 2, or 3 to go and like have them guide their personal life, how they get married, how they get divorced, what's the age of custody, things that are really important for people. And especially activists are concerned about the age of marriage, which they worry would be lowered tremendously under clerical authority to the age of 9. The age of custody is another thing, like how young is a child taken away from their mother. And currently in Iraq, you have up to 15 years basically of maternal custody, which is quite high. So that's the things that the activists are really concerned about. I've spoken a lot, and I'm happy to send you articles about this to the clerics in Najaf about this potential law. And in general, they see it in 2 ways. First, they see it as the Shia Islamists trying to corner them by saying, look, we're passing a law that you like. It's a law that will let your religious rules guide your adherence. This is what you want. And now you look like you're allied to us again. They're almost punishing the clerics for having turned against them, which is just some internal politicking. At the same time, they don't want to go against the law because they say, we would like to run the affairs of our religious community. We would like to have a religious law that's all legally obligating for if people choose into it. But I'm imagining a lot of parents would choose for their kids, and then that would make it involuntary in so many ways. So it would take away the state's ability to protect minors being the key point. So this is still like in play as I'm speaking to you today. There's been a lot of distraction because of the war in Lebanon right now. But it would be a really big setback for Iraq if this happened. And clerics have been very stubborn about rejecting it because they say, religious law is particularly concerning family law is something where they feel their purview is it is a place of their authority. It's social authority. So it's theirs. So this is what's, I think this is what you're alluding to in terms of their influence over these laws. Yeah.
Yes, thank you first for the presentation very much. The professor mentioned that one word she did not hear too much of in the presentation was succession. Another word that I did not hear too much of, if at all, is women.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was wondering is, for example, you mentioned the cleric who boasted that the school of Najaf is incomparable, people of knowledge of the Sultan and things like this. And I'm suspecting that in their viewpoint, the people of knowledge does not include women. Correct me if I'm wrong. I saw the titles of the religious hierarchy that you mentioned, like Hujjatullah, Mujtahid, Ayatullah, and so forth. I suspect that they're not really women who find their way to these exalted positions. So that's what I wanted to ask about in this 1,000-year-old institution, as you described it. Has there been any real, substantial presence of women? I suspect not, and more importantly, I'd like to know the state that now.
That's a really excellent question. So, for the most part, the development of women's seminaries has taken place after 2003. So part of my fieldwork, I actually went to several seminaries where women were being trained. And the theological debate isn't about whether women can study any of these things, but women can't be, for a lot of clerics, women can't be the Grand Ayatollah, the head of the seminary. One of the qualifications for some is you have to be male. That being said, we have examples from Iran of 2 different women who had become, had reached the level of a mujtahid, of someone who could issue rulings. So there's really nothing against it at all. Perhaps a social norm, but you know, and I'm not a theological expert, but there's nothing particularly anti-woman about the dissemination of knowledge within Islam or within Shia Islam. And no, well, I'm saying like theology is one thing and then practice is another, but Iran, which is always considered, you know, from the outside, like to be the most conservative case, actually has a history of having female seminaries, of having clerics who are women. And in fact, there's an argument among clerics right now, the younger ones, that you need female clerics because sometimes women don't want to speak to men about some things. So this is something that is also rapidly changing.
That's another question. And one of the things that changed in Iran in the early periods that the seminarians came into the seminary with a government, at least probably high school education. And this made some difference in things like attitude toward science and sort of a broader view of the world. Does the same thing happen in Iraq?
So there are no clerics that have occupied very high positions of power in Iraq. There are a few examples of clerics. One is a minister, one member of parliament.
That's not what I'm asking about the background of the students coming into the seminaries and that sort of worldview of the people on your pyramid.
Oh, so what Najaf is known for is that it's even more specialized and that it teaches really jurisprudence more than anything else. And they even think of the Iranian seminary as having too many subfields and too many majors. So if you imagine, they're even more like focused and concentrated on a particular type of Islamic knowledge. And back in the, I would say, 60s and 70s, when students were entering, they were less likely to have a high school education. Like the seminary used to play traditionally a role of being the school. And then it became a place where clerical families would send their kids to continue learning. But today, a lot of clerics of the generation in the 90s and the early 2000s actually have finished university before they enter the seminary. So the norm around that is actually changing. You won't see the effect of it for another 40 years until this particular generation has risen to the top of the pyramid. But it's not stagnant. Like more and more people are getting education in a formal university as well as in the seminary because they want to position themselves to be a professor, for example, or because they want to engage in a broader religious community or attend conferences in like Egypt or Jordan or something. So that will likely change. The impact of it is less pronounced in Iraq, which is why I was saying about the different religious figures in power, because while in Iran, the clerics really found themselves out of their depth because, you know, they weren't policymakers, right? In Iraq, you didn't have as many clerics who were actually in positions of political authority. Like I said, I did this analysis of like the Iraqi parliament, and the city that has the most clerical MPs is actually a Kurdish city. So it's nothing relating to this institution. And that's for a particular reason as well. So hopefully the impact of that is less pronounced on policy.
In Iran, in sort of 30s and 40s, the children of clerical families moved into the secular professions, medicine, education, and so on. But I had an Iraqi student who was trained as a doctor and also did private study in Najaf and philosophy, and then ended up in America after the 91 war and got a master's degree from the Dominican Seminary in California with a PhD here.
Checked all the boxes, that one. Very employable.
I'd like to ask about the social media impact on the authority of the Shia religious leadership. A lot of social media that I follow among the people even in Syria, it's just ridiculing the Shia practice and beliefs and so on. I'm sure you're aware of that. And I think if you take this as, oh my God, this is kind of all over the place in the Middle East, it will definitely lead to something much bigger than just having fun, or just trying really hard to show how ridiculous, mythical, totally fantastic the the Shia faith is. So what is your take on it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of videos circulating about, you know, clerics saying, like you said, ridiculous things or things that are just seemed out of touch with the general population. So one thing that clerics have been criticized for is being completely inaccessible to youth and just, you know, not really living in the same day and age as them. But that's always been the case because clerics always tend to be like a few generations ahead of the typical follower or person who might be their follower. In Iraq, and across the Middle East, it's particularly striking right now because the average age in Iraq is 21. Meanwhile, the average Grand Ayatollah is somewhere deep into their 90s, right? So that I think that's a natural consequence. I haven't done a social media analysis, and I don't know anyone who has of this, but my perception is that younger clerics will try to adapt to this. And you can see some clerics positioning themselves as like, you know, social media savvy clerics and trying to appeal to you. So there's several examples I can think of. None of them very inspiring to me personally, but they seem to have like succeeded with a particular subset of Shia youth in Iraq. That being said, there's a big question about is, religiosity on the decline across the Middle East. What does this mean for the religious institution? Will it survive if it doesn't have as many followers as before? And they're very much thinking about that. And one of the things that they have done to counteract it is that they've actually become more financially independent by having what you call like social enterprises. So they basically own businesses and have investments now, which they haven't had in the past. So they might not need the adherence for much longer, but I don't have the data off the top of my head about religiosity in the Middle East. I will say that the last poll I saw, Iraq is still a lot more religious than other countries in the region, but I think in general, the region might be drifting downwards. And things are changing a lot, and I would not underestimate the impact of the Israeli war in Gaza and in Lebanon on perception of like religious figures right now, but it's still too early to measure that as well.
Could I ask a question about institutional stability more generally? So I'm interested in what it is about various institutions that allows them to maintain authority. And one of the things that came up in the discussion was the fact that there's disagreement between clerics about particular issues. How does that function to strengthen the institution rather than undermine its authority? Right. So if you think about sort of American legal institutions, you know, we do have a final authority, right? The Supreme Court, right? And their rulings have implications for the way in which those under them behave, right? Of course, we do have in the American legal system also disagreement, right? But in particular, I'm interested in the way in which the fact that, say, Sistani's fatwa is not binding, is not finally binding. How does that work to help maintain the strength of the institution? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think the way it works in theory and in practice, it might be a little different just because of what we were talking about like the very young population, is that it creates a bigger marketplace for clerics, which keeps the seminary useful or like an agent of growth and career growth for a lot of people. So if we knew that it was only Sistani that you could follow and that he would designate a successor and you had to follow this firm line, then there would be really less interest in having such a seminary. It would just be like, you know, Sistani's seminary, and if you want to have a future, you go there, and that's that. But I think it contributes to why it's even needed as an institution and the spirit of competition. Also, hopefully, it will give clerics an opportunity to be more responsive to society if they they describe themselves as democratic. So this is a very interesting comparison. I've never heard it compared to usually it gets compared to the Vatican, right? Never to the Supreme Court.
Right. I'm just thinking of this. I'm thinking of institutions generally.
Yeah, no, it's a
Right.
good
You right. So we could think of the institution in which we're at right now, and we have senior leadership who make rulings about certain
yeah.
ways in which we're supposed to behave, for example, and yet there's space for resistance in that, and I think that similarly to the way you described it, that allows for there to be it allows the space that dispute allows prevents the rigidity that can undermine an institution.
That
and
makes it irrelevant.
Yeah.
The other thing is, and something that I was not expecting before I did my fieldwork, is how much they thought of themselves as an academic institution and how often, I've seen some people make this comparison and I quite agree with it. Like, it is very much like a university in the sense of they really do view themselves as like competing scholars. And the other thing is that never underestimate how loyal they are to the institution itself, to the point that they not every single cleric, but there's multiple examples of clerics who are willing to harm themselves in order to protect the institution. And I would, maybe a controversial opinion, but that's how I would actually describe Grand Ayatollah Hui, who was so unwilling to support a revolution in 1991 because of his big fear of chaos. So their biggest fear is fawda, chaos. And if you talk to his students, it's because he really thought the blowback would be on the institution. So he became extremely unpopular among a generation of Iraqis for not standing with them. But if you talk to his students, it's because he was so worried that this would end badly for Najaf and for the seminary in it. So they're self-preservationist, particularly the elites, to a degree that might bring them harm. So I don't know how much your belief in an institution can keep it going, but that's something I wasn't expecting to see, and I really saw.
Do you have other questions?
I did have a quick question. We've spoken so much about the establishment. I was just curious about a particular phrase and if it's used in Iraq at all, according to your observation. There's a phrase, I know it's used repeatedly in Egyptian media, maybe in some other Arabic-speaking countries. I don't know about Iraq specifically, but this phrase that I often come across, Rijaluddin, men of religion, Rajuddin, religious man. And like I've always said, from the first time I saw that, what about the Nisa'uddin, the women of religion, or Imra'a, Diniya, religious woman? Is that used in the Iraqi media, this Rijaluddin, Rajuddin, as much as it's used so frequently in our media? Because to me, it indicates a suggestion that religion is a male dictatorship.
So if you make the mistake of saying the Rijaluddin in the seminary, they will be angry at you. They don't like clerics as a term. They prefer to be called scholars, ulama, or talabat ilm, seekers of knowledge, which is more gender neutral than Rijaluddin, which is very much men of religion. Iraqi media sometimes will, depending on which media source, will sometimes use that, but the way they identify is very much not as clerics. They don't want to be compared to priests. They're seekers of knowledge is how they would self-describe. Scholars is the other one, which is why I was making the academic comparison.
In fact, they use the word the turban scholar a lot in Iraq, and Muhammad.
Yes, that's to have the institutionalization of it a little bit, but without having to say that he's a Rajuddin, right? Yeah, they get so offended. Never make that mistake around them like I did.
I'm curious, thinking about institutional loyalty in your conversations with people, do you get the sense that this is from like feelings that the institution has done something for them, or that it's important for the religion, or that it's this idea of like dedication to your body? Like where does that come from?
It's a really good question because I actually spent a lot of time thinking of where this comes from. And the best answer I got from observation is that you're socialized into it. Socialized into, you know, if you ask them to introduce a seminary, they'll all introduce it in exactly the same way. They'll tell you like the, you know, mythical story of how it started, of you know how many times it's been under pressure and survived. So it's definitely something that like has a big legacy, but you're also like invested in this legacy, and you see yourself as something bigger, and serving your faith as well is a big part of it. So the reason it becomes, you know, as you go up the hierarchy, you become more socialized to be more preservationist of it, and you see yourself as integral into it, which is why I was saying I've never worried about succession, because by that point you're just saying what everyone else is saying, and you've been groomed to be someone who is preservationist of it first and foremost. Sorry, did you have earlier?
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you for joining us today, and please join me in thanking our speaker. Thank you very much.
Really a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. You've like engaged so much and given me so many ideas, including the Supreme Court comparison. I have to think about institutions more strongly now.